Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a podcast, sometimes video series about the topic of designing better miniature games. The two of us design miniature games, and so we like to think about designing them and talk about designing them and hear from you guys about whether you're designing things. So we are, well, I suppose I should introduce myself. My name's Mike, and I'm a designer of things like Gaslands and A Billion Suns, both available from Osprey Games. Glenn is also a fine designer of games, both miniature and card and board games. Say hi, Glenn.
Hi.
We, in our last conversation in this series of game design conversations, we're discussing the opportunities and challenges of writing solo modes, solo scenarios, and indeed full solitaire miniature war games. Something that has obviously been a hot topic over the last couple of years, as a lot more people have played miniature games themselves, and something that a topic that I've been super interested in because I've been writing my own solo games for a while. And one of the things that is very commonly thrown up in the design process of writing a solo miniatures game is, how do you get the miniatures not controlled by the player to move around sensibly and threateningly and somewhat intelligently and successfully or satisfyingly threaten and thwart and frustrate the active player, the real human player, from achieving their objectives. And so we tend to call this artificial intelligence, or AI. It's a bit of a grand term for a probable like 3 bullet points of whether or not the skeleton attacks, but I think through the process of designing solo modes, and in particular through the process of collaborating, Glenn and I collaborating on Perilous Tales, we sort of got deep into some questions about how to create these AI systems in miniature war games rules. And I think some maybe best practices of some things that you would normally obviously just do, but actually, if you really think about them, they're kind of the wrong approach, and you should probably do the opposite, which does tend to be a bit of a theme of this series of conversations. So I guess we'll talk about some of the obvious things and maybe debunk them or offer some alternative approaches.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about writing sort of cardboard AI is it's really hard. It's so hard. And I think
I would posit to you that it's quite easy to write a bad one, or it's quite easy to write one that looks fine and ends up being quite either not challenging or quite boring.
Yeah. So there are a bunch of problems with writing a cardboard AI, and I think there are at least a few golden rules, and so we'll go through some of those and move on. So, I mean, the problem with cardboard AI, first of all, is that humans are smart and cardboard is dumb. And fundamentally, the best AI that you're ever going to write is always going to feel like, but a person would have done something smarter in that position. If I outwit the AI, then a person would have been smarter, and that's a big issue. The two places in which cardboard AI goes particularly dumb are sort of solutions, attempts to solve each other. The first thing is that it's predictable. Cardboard AI is inevitably very predictable because it has a set of rules, because you're piloting it, and it has to set out that set of rules, and you're allowed to pre-read those rules. So it's like playing an opponent that calls their move every single time at this, at the start of each round.
Imagine before you've had a chance to move your stuff and therefore pre-react to it.
So it's like playing a game of Warhammer where you're going first in a turn, but the other person before you move goes, "This is what I'm going to do with my stuff after you've moved. That's what I'm going to do with that unit. That's what I'll do with that unit. That unit will end up there. Now have at it." And it's like, of course, that person is going to get his absolute butt handed to him. He's going to get panned, and the AI has to do that because you're piloting the AI. And the first way in which that big problem is solved is putting in random things for the AI to do. The AI will act randomly. At this point, it will, instead of just going for the main threat, it might angle off and go over to a more minor threat, or it might just dance around in circles like an idiot. And the problem is that if it can do random things, it can end up just ping-ponging between two things because it keeps changing its mind like an idiot because it's random. Or sometimes the really obvious thing to do is the really obvious thing to do for a good reason, and no human being would ever in a million years not do that obvious thing. And it's not an Achilles heel that you do the obvious thing, because it's like, oh well, the obvious thing is win the game. Shall I win the game? Well, just a minute, I'll roll a dice to see if I'll win the game. It turns out I'm not going to. It turns out I'm going to go over here. And cardboard AI with random events sometimes just turns around and goes, oh, instead of winning, I think I'm going to go over here and look at this tree very, very closely. There, you weren't expecting that. And it's often given as a sort of excuse for those sorts of moments. Sometimes humans are dumb as well. Sometimes humans do weird things and let you off and give you an opportunity that you weren't expecting. And it's like, yeah, sometimes they do, but even when they do, what they never do is just do donuts in the middle of the table because they're switching between a set of random sort of objective points randomly, and they happen to be looping round and round and round. So I think those are the two biggest problems that you tend to encounter with cardboard AI, and there's sort of one's an attempt to solve the other one, and the other one is just an inherent issue with it.
Yeah, and then I think that some of the ways that those manifest as specific problems are you can lure a cardboard AI in quite a predictable way, and then you can also you can carry it around on a string, so that by, I guess the two expressions of this are, you can make it choose the target that you want it to target, and so it doesn't go after the thing that you would rather it didn't, and you can pull it away from wherever the threatening location was, so that you can just carry on with the winning of the game. Yeah. And those two things are very much the first problem that you're talking about there, where they are predictable, and so therefore you would want to say, well, sometimes I randomly don't go for the obvious little sort of fall guy that you've put in front of me.
Yeah,
and it needs to be, in order to be satisfying, it needs to be a bit more of a halfway house.
I mean, I think it's significant that obviously digital AI has a lot more sort of complexity able to be built into it, and has been worked on a lot longer with a lot more resources into it. And still, kiting is very much a thing in sort of digital AI games, where you attract the tank attracts the attention of a particular monster and then backs down the corridor, so it keeps running after it as the ranged people pile their bow shots into it. And sort of digital AI has very often struggled and not been able to get over kiting. So it's really going to be pretty tricky for your cardboard AI that doesn't have. And this is the other, I think, huge problem with AI, cardboard AI, is it's fiddly to operate. Cardboard AI.
Or said another way, you have to make it simple enough to operate that it's not a terrible drain and a boring thing, and that limits the amount of complexity you can build into it. So if you wanted to build, Diablo's computer AI into the system, then it would be, several pages long of checking and cross-checking, and that would be no good. It would be a rubbish play experience. And so you have to make it simple, and the simpleness means that you end up in a place that that is filled with compromises and potential
absolutely
dumbness.
You've got to make it sort of reasonably engageable with, and like I say,
I mean, that is one of the advantages of the random table system, is in something like Warhammer Quest Silver Tower or 7TV, you roll a dice and then you do what it says, and that interface is very simple. It's very quick to, what do I do? Oh yeah, you roll the dice and you follow the instructions.
And I think so. I think the two sort of obvious ways of putting together tabletop AI is a flow chart or a set of tables, and the set of tables are quicker to engage with because you roll a dice and you look it up and you don't have to read any preceding steps, but they sometimes do something that's really, really dumb. The flow chart is, okay, you go through steps one at a time, and you go if then but not statements piled up onto each other, and with that you can build as smart an AI as you're willing to force your players through the fine mesh of doing it.
And this work. So a specific example of this is in the AD&D board games, for example, Castle Ravenloft, and each monster has a card, and each card has, is there a hero in an adjacent dungeon tile? Then do this. Is there a hero in this dungeon tile? Then do this. Is there a hero in an adjacent square? Then do this. And those monsters individually will always behave in a certain way, but of course, because you're randomly throwing out different monsters, well, the burning skeleton does one thing and the ghost does another thing and the minotaur does another thing, and so you get variety because those flowcharts are individually programmed. And so it's not that burning skeletons are unpredictable, it's that the game is unpredictable because you don't know whether you're getting a minotaur or a burning skeleton.
Yeah, and a combination of a dice system and so often I think in our conversations, hybrid systems are a good idea. A hybrid, there's a, if you go with all one thing, you're inevitably going to exacerbate the problems of that one thing. And possibly, yes, a hybrid system is a good idea. I think one of the issues to a degree with particularly building an AI for a pre-existing system is that you don't have control over what that system has available in it to a degree. So I mean, as in with Perilous Tales, which is, a whole bespoke solo system, we can say, okay, I know that it's not going to be a problem that this monster doesn't move a particular rate or move in a particular way, because I've put everything else that's in the game, and I know that nothing's going to outrange this monster or be further away than this detection roll, or be able to outrun him when he charges. Whereas if you're building an AI for a pre-existing system, like if you're building an AI for Malifaux, it's way, way, way harder to go, I know everything that everybody's going to bring to this tabletop, and I know which combination they're going to bring them to the tabletop, unless you start building so many structures around controlling them.
Right, and in a game like Castle Ravenloft or Perilous Tales, the monsters have been simplified to the point where they are 100% automatons. If you are trying to automate characters or models that have been designed for human consumption, it's excruciatingly difficult. Malifaux is a fantastic example of a system with lots of options that an individual model could take, and then lots of additional triggers or choices that the player has to make based on the results of cards flipping out and so forth. And so Malifaux is an example of an extremely difficult to automate system because of the depth of the player choice baked into every miniature's rules and the basic system itself. And so, like, that's sort of going back to the, like, how I got into Perilous Tales, like trying to automate the difficult, complicated decision making for the internal special rules of a model. And you can imagine doing the same thing with Warhammer 40,000. Like if I'm playing Warhammer 40,000, I've got a set of interacting rules and special abilities that I'm supposed to be triggering off each other. The temptation, I think, is to move towards a hollow version of that, where the output from that model is roughly the same level of power or threat, but that you've scooped all of the insides of that watermelon out, and you've just said, do you know what, it just teleports over there and then explodes, because normally I would have to do a complicated series of actions to guarantee that action, but when the chips are down, because this thing can't think for itself, I'm just going to allow it to do the really powerful things in an easy way.
Yeah, and I think that sort of the mention of, again, hollow AI is worth sort of talking a little bit further about. So, for example, let's say, imagine a game like Malifaux where a certain model is going to buff a certain other model if they're within a certain range, and a human player that brings one of those models is going to get it buffed by the other model. I don't know, let's say 2/3 of the game. You can either write an AI that says, if model X is on table, move to within distance of model X unless model X has already moved, in which case don't move further away from model X than distance X, and then when you trigger model X, move it. Or you can say, roll a dice on a 3 or more model gets that buff, because that's what a human being is doing for that model. 2/3 of the time it's giving it that buff. You can hollow out those things and just recreate what a human being would do with a much simpler step, and it generally works fine for a lot of those sorts of things.
I think this is slightly off topic, but I think it's sort of related to the complexities of writing an AI system for an existing game. Is in something like Perilous Tales, I simplified the core system a lot so that there's a very small number of stats for each model, and the way that you resolve combat is quite simplistic, because I didn't need to build in a bunch of player decisions on both sides of the table that interact in interesting ways. And so I think that's another element, is that as you're thinking about designing the AI, like if I've got an AI system that has, each monster has 5 to 9 stats, and I need to somehow consume those on little cards, like that's for me really tricky. Like, why doesn't each miniature move at the same rate or fight with just one stat or whatever? Because you've got to realize that these automatons have to be processed really fast by the player, who doesn't care what they do because he's not making decisions about them. So it just needs to say, this is what it does, rather than providing you with a selection of options that all interact in a way that that are interesting to interact with, because you don't want to spend any time operating that machine.
Yeah, and I think one of the big problems is you can hollow out buffing. So you can hollow out the internal buffs that a given force would operate in and of itself. The things that a human player would choose to give their own models, you can randomly generate. You can quite simply generate an AI that acts once it has identified the correct priority. Because once you identify the correct priority, you move towards it, you attack it, you go over and trigger it. That's not really that hard. Priority identification for AI, that's the nut to crack. That's the thing that actually contains a lot of the problems, and that's the sort of thing that human beings are super good at. You're like really naturally just immediately good at, and writing those rules out in paper is an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, and so I think, like, going back to what are the most obvious things that you would naturally do and why are they bad, like this is absolutely the critical one, and it talks to the leading them around on the string as well. Like, if your targeting criteria is pick the closest enemy model, that's super predictable and super open to all kinds of player abuse and just being a boring system. So I think it's very obvious, and pretty much every AI system that you will look at will say this thing targets the closest enemy model. Very occasionally it will say it targets the model within a range that's got the lowest wounds, which is a better and more interesting system. But I think that targeting decision making computer is, I think, a really interesting place to play around with.
Yeah, I think personally it's the nub of like writing an AI system and writing a good, difficult to play against AI system. And it's the place where if your AI system is going to get sprawling and difficult to operate, it's the thing that's tempting to get sprawling and difficult to operate with. It's like, as a human being playing whatever, let's say Warhammer Fantasy Battle, your priority targeting system basically starts with read every single army book, understand every single unit in every single army book, then understand which unit in which army is the key pin piece to that army's sort of tactical pivot, target that one first. And clearly writing that out into a full AI is insane. And again, that's why I say, if you can limit what is being put into the game, if I could give you the army list that you're going to be playing in Warhammer, then I can relatively easily write a targeting system for the AI to play against that army list, because I know what the AI should be picking out first, and there are some things where I can say, I don't care whether the dragon is bearing right down on you, you keep shooting that wizard and till he's dead. That's the first priority, everything else is secondary. Once you say you can take any army you like in whatever system, you're really onto a sort of hiding to nothing, trying to write a targeting system for that isn't going to be out and out dumb sometimes.
So I think in the spirit of providing some fairly specific examples, because I think this is absolutely critical when it comes to the AI, I'll just read out a couple of examples that we've worked on together, because these are like places where and these are far from perfect, and they are a bit complicated, but this is sort of what we mean by making a targeting system that's less obviously just picking the nearest model. So in Perilous Tales, when one of these AI controlled models needs to select what is called a target hero, so it's, attacks target hero, what does target hero mean? Then you have a little flowchart, and you see which of the first of these is true, and it's attempting to make sure that the model that's selected is like within range of being aggressed and is also the one that matters and is going to change the game state. So if no model fulfills a given criteria, then you skip it and use the next. So first, is there a model within 7 inches? So yes, there might be one model within 7 inches, in which case we have our target, but there might be 2 or 3 models within 7 inches, so we haven't yet found our target, but now we've like grouped those 3, those are sort of selected for us. Is one of those 3 within 3 inches of an objective marker? So of the 3 that are within 7 inches, is one of them looking like they're about to score some points, in which case, brilliant, let's go find that guy. Or maybe there's 2 there's 2 heroes standing next to an objective marker because they were about to team up and set some dynamite or something, in which case we go to the third criteria, which is the model with the fewest wounds. So of these 2 goons that are standing next to the dynamite about to blow up my nest of eggs, is one of them looking like a softer target, in which case I'm going to select that one. And if they're both unwounded and have the same number of wounds, then the 4th criteria is let's choose randomly between the heroes that match these criteria. So that's a little bit of a complicated thing, but once you get your head around it, it's essentially the AI model making quite a detailed survey of the immediate area, and trying to find a target that's based on those kind of objective based logic.
And I think in relation to that, some of the early issues that came up with working through the AI in Perilous Tales was there is an ability to, for example, is somebody within 7 inches. There was a point where we target the closest model, means that somebody stood 8 inches away because the monster can run up to 7 inches and became the target. And then a bunch of other people lined up 9 inches away with guns that have a range of 10 inches. And you just get a bad guy running up and down a shooting gallery.
Mm-hmm.
But because we have control of the full system, we can go, well, okay, we're not going to have guns that have that kind of range. We're not going to target the nearest model. We're not going to allow somebody to be able to stand just outside of the charge range, whilst other people stand slightly further away from that and shoot. And this is one of the things where, once you have control of the full system, you can make life easier for your AI, and therefore easier for the players who are piloting your AI, in a way that you can't if you go, I don't know what range guns people are going to have available. I don't know what their charge ranges are going to be. And I think one of the important points, again, the one golden rule I would say personally for writing AI is don't make me make a choice for the AI. And that's something
that's really important. And I was really delighted when you kind of put that down as a principle as we were working on the game, because it eliminates, number one, it's a really crisp design principle that's really easy to spot places where you violate that. And the other thing is it's genuinely great for the sort of player's experience of your game, because they bump, like, one of the frustrating things is you bump into a situation in a solo game and you're like, I don't really know what to do, and so I don't know whether to disadvantage myself because that's playing in the spirit of the game, or to advantage myself because I'm trying to win. So of course, all the other decisions I'm making in this game are to advantage myself. So why would there suddenly be a decision that I have to make where I have to flip my brain around and say, no, I need to disadvantage myself? And the other thing is that it makes things a lot faster, because if I'm not making any decisions, I'm just like, oh, okay, I need to, yeah, okay, just I did what I was told, and now the game is essentially moved itself to the next stage of its puzzle, and then the game is the puzzle, not you are trying to challenge yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the places where AIs most regularly fall down, is where there's you fall into a gap and you've got to make a choice for the AI. And it's the most regular place where in theory those games hit the blue screen, because in theory what you do there is you go, well, I don't know what to do now, and you walk away from the game. In reality, you go, I don't know, I think I should probably do the right thing for the AI. Or you go, well, obviously the designer intended for any choice I make to advantage me, so I should advantage me. But in reality, if you're playing rules as written, what you should do is sit there going, because that's what the game has done. The game has hit one of those errors where it's like, I meant to tell you what to do, and I'm not telling you what to do, so don't do anything.
Yeah, so never force the player to make a decision on behalf of the AI is super interesting as a principle. And I think actually when you start to try and apply that principle to your own solo AI design, it's actually really easy to apply that principle, because like there's always the roll of dice backstop. So if you have, for example, in this targeting criteria, you have a bunch of things which are didactic, and then you run out of didactic options, then you go, well, okay, and now pick one at random. You could have started with the pick one at random, but then that bumps into all of the problems that we talked about, you know, erratic, ludicrous AI behavior.
Yeah.
But it's a great backstop. And so some other ways where this can manifest is if a monster, for example, spawns because you rolled to generate a monster, where I place that monster on the table, like you might say, oh, place that monster within 3 inches of the heroic leader of the party. And that sounds didactic, but actually I've got a ton of different places that I could place that. It could be behind cover, it could be in melee range of my guys, it could be between 2 of my guys. And so just writing a rule that says something like place it within 3 inches of the heroic leader and as close to the enemy board edge as possible. Now you've got a direct line. There's only one place on the table that meets that criteria. And you have got no more decision making. You just added 5 words and there's no decision making for the player.
Yeah, I think something to be super aware of, I like weirdly aware of when writing AI rules is terrain and terrain effects, because that's one of those ones that's very easy to get blind spotted on, where you then get an AI bumping into a wall or unable to walk through something, and you know, a malicious player, you know, kites the AI into just running into a building where the rules don't give you ways of going through buildings that don't have doors. And again, if you're building a full system, you can protect yourself by controlling these sorts of terrain that are available in the game. But if there's a full terrain, rules are a nightmare enough anyway for human beings to sort of engage with. Having an AI engage with terrain rules is super hard. And if I was writing an AI for a fully pre-existing system, I would basically give it like the ethereal rule, pretty much. Just you know what, they just ghost through all terrain. I'm not gonna
right. And going back to an earlier comment, I think in our previous conversation about when you've got a robot opponent, it's okay if they're a bit more powerful. Like what your ethereal rule there is basically saying is, do you know what, I'm going to give them an elastic movement value. They're supposed to move 5 inches, but in order to pathfind around that tree, it would have taken 6 or 9 inches or something. Screw it, like let's just say they have a 9-inch move and they found a way to get to that point. It doesn't matter exactly how they got there. I'm just gonna sort of skip over that by giving them the ethereal rule. It's not that they're literally ghosts, it's that I've given them an elastic movement value to get to where they need to go to threaten you and frustrate you as the player, and that's okay.
Yeah, it makes your life easier. It makes the game better because it makes the AI stronger, which is a good idea because the AI is not that bright.
And you could have said, well, move up to 9 inches, pathfinding the shortest way to this thing, avoiding terrain. But like, you've just got a bunch of uncertainty and decision-making potential that the player has to worry about.
Yeah, exactly.
One other thing I wanted to bring up before we conclude on this conversation is reactions. So I think that's maybe an underutilized part of AI, which is it's very normal to have an AI sequence that triggers in an enemy phase. But I think it's also super interesting to consider an AI system that either completely triggers off player actions or is both triggering off player actions and getting its own enemy phase. So if I attack something, does it immediately make a move back? If I walk within some inches of something, does it immediately move or make an attack? So I think reaction systems are super interesting because they increase the threat potential of those models because they can interrupt, and they also give you the potential for things like turnovers and there's lots of potential for frustrating a player's intent and forcing them to think more carefully about their actions, which is of course what we're trying to achieve with a solo system, is to make you think, here is a puzzle. It goes back to that kind of board pressure idea that we talked about a billion years ago. Having reactions, particularly ones that trigger off sort of proximity bubbles, creates this really interesting spatial puzzle of pressure zones. Having reactions that trigger off being targeted by spells or guns or whatever creates a sort of a similar spatial puzzle or tactical puzzle where it's like, okay, in which order can I attack these things because they're going to react to my actions?
Yeah, and I mean, and just a very quick thing to say, it should probably be obvious, but it's sometimes a lot better for everybody to write multiple different AI systems for a close combat aggressive thing, a ranged shooty thing, an objective dealing thing, than one master. One thing always sounds simpler than three things. Not always the case. And what you can do, of course, is you can have a pre-table to let your guys switch between those different modes depending on what's going on. If you, I don't know, let's say you had Warhammer Savage Orcs, at one point they can quite happily switch from being a ranged defensive unit to an aggressive unit, depending on sort of some preloaded decisions.
Right, or if you've got a guard, then they might have a set of AI for when they are patrolling and a set of separate AI for when they are, on high alert.
Okay, I think that's a good place to wrap up on that conversation. We haven't we haven't, I think, gone as deep as we could have done on this one, like, just passing over priority selection as that's really hard. So yeah, if you would like us to talk more about this, drop a comment into the comment section. If you have created an AI yourself, if there's an AI you particularly enjoy engaging with, a favorite opponent, please let us know. We're more than happy to sort of come back to this in the future. This conversation was partly based on a comment in our comment section, so if you'd like us to talk more about this, if you'd like us to talk about related things, unrelated things, whatever, drop a comment in the comment section. Look us up on social media, but for now, I think from this episode of Rule of Carnage, it's going to be goodbye. So thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.